Assalamu alaikum. It is I, Ahmed ibn Fadlan, great medieval explorer. I have explored the world from the sands of Ethiopia to the northernmost realms of Europe, where I have met with the people called Scandinavians, and today I shall bring you a report as to their music. This is the worst Arabic accent ever attempted by any human being. I should be able to do an Arabic accent because I was a wedding photographer for a Lebanese studio for 8 years here in Montreal, so I should at least be able to do a Lebanese accent, but oh well. Tragedy. That is how we begin this video, my friends, with tragedy. Strong beginning. Now, to the subject of the video. I made another video of this type before called The Sound of Ancient Greek and Roman Music. The difference with that video is that when it comes to the music of the Norse, we're not well informed. It is not an attested form of music. We don't have any notated compositions from Scandinavia during the Viking Age. We certainly don't have any treatises or descriptions of how their music worked. Instead, the video will be divided in 3 chapters. The first one being what we do know about Norse music. And what we do know of Norse music of the Viking Age is principally the instruments. We can reconstruct them with a fair degree of accuracy. We know the materials that they were made out of, the strings, etc. So we can reconstruct with a fair degree of accuracy the acoustic soundscape of Scandinavia in the Viking Age, but that's just the noise. We're not talking about the music necessarily. Secondly, we'll talk about the educated guesses that we can make. Upon observing global human history, the entire world, or localized regions within a certain span of time, you can extract certain universals, if you will. And so there's certain elements in ethnomusicology where you don't need to have direct attestations of them in order to just assume that they existed. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And then finally, we'll talk about what Norse music was not. And that's what we're going to start with. This is an important chapter to deal with right off the gate, because a lot of the people watching this video will be thinking to themselves, well, I do know what Norse music sounded like. I know Warjuna, I know Heilung, I know Einar Selvig's work, etc. What must be understood is that these bands are not remotely even trying to be producing historically accurate pieces of music. What they're doing is not the music that the Norse themselves were producing. This is something very important to understand. These are not ethnomusicologists rigorously trained in the science of music history, sort of rigorously coming up with the most probable depictions of what Norse music was like. That's not what they're doing. What they're doing is, essentially, if you break down their music structurally, it's pop music, it's rock music, it's metal music, because that's their background as musicians. They're just playing it on ancient instruments, so they're giving it that sort of superficial historical vibe. And that's all it is. It's superficially historical, but really, it's actually, there's chords, there's counterpoint, it's rock and metal music. This type of music should be approached as a compromise of sorts. It's a compromise. It's not literally the music that the Norse heard. It's music where, the mainstream audience, they want to be able to connect with the Norse, but with music that they can still be entertained by. They still want to be able to bang their heads to the music. They still want to find it interesting. And so it has to be modern music, because obviously as a modern audience, we connect with modern music more easily. They want to connect with the Norse, but on terms that they can understand. They don't just want completely historically accurate music, because that would be boring to most people. And I'll link in the description of this video recordings by actual ethnomusicologists who have done actual reconstructive work from a scientific point of view, and you'll hear that it's quite some distance from what you hear with Warjuna and Heilung and all that gang. Einar Selvig and the rest, it's not that they're ignorant. They know what they're doing. They're just not trying to be historical. So their music should be approached in the same vein as Wagner's music 200 years ago. You all know the Helicopter Vietnam song. It's the Ride of the Valkyries. That is Norse-themed music, but it's not actually Norse music. It's modern music of Wagner's day and age, using his musical language, but it evokes a theme of the Norse. And that's what the music of Einar Selvig and Warjuna, Skald, etc. is. So right off the gate, whatever you think Norse music sounds like, forget about Warjuna and everything. They're not even trying to be historically accurate. So this is not meant as a criticism, by the way, because some people will think that I'm criticizing them. I'm not sort of pointing out a deficiency in their music where they've failed to produce something historically accurate. They're not even trying to do so. They're bringing us something that we can connect to as a modern audience. So this gets us to the second chapter of the video. What we do know of Norse music lies mainly in the instrumental aspect, and credit must be given where credit is due. Einar Selvig, Warjuna, Skald, etc., all that gang, they do utilize historically accurate instruments, especially Einar Selvig. His lyres, for example, they are created by Benjamin Simao, who's a very respected luthier. I don't doubt that these instruments have some modifications brought to them where they can compete with the acoustic capabilities of modern instruments, but other than that, for the most part, the instruments are pretty much historically accurate. They're not played in a historically accurate manner. They'll play modern chords on it, for example, but the instrument itself is historically accurate. So as far as the soundscape is concerned, you can more or less, listen to Warjuna and go, that is somewhat close to the music of the Norse, but not entirely. The first instrument that we have to talk about is the lyre. I've talked about it in more detail in my previous video. Lyres were the dominant stringed instruments of West Eurasia for most of history. Certainly they were in the Viking Age. We actually don't have, as far as I know, any indications that there were lutes in Scandinavia at that time. There's no evidence of lutes or the guitar, buzuki, balama, that kind of family of instrument. Then you have flutes. Now flutes are one of those things where, you talk about human universals. Even if we did not find direct evidence of flutes in Scandinavia in the Viking Age, we'd still assume that they had them simply because, flutes are so universally distributed across all of humankind. They also had a pan flute called the Jorvik panpipe, which is kind of interesting. It's this nifty little instrument that they could carry around and play very easily. I have two of them. I cannot play either one for the life of me. The blowing technique is maybe one day I'll be able to. That's another tragedy to add to the list of Ahmed ibn Fadlan's life is very tragic, is it not? I want to talk a little bit about bowed instruments. Now, bowed instruments, possibly the main instrument of that modern Viking genre is the toggle harpa. The toggle harpa, really, I hear it far more than the lyre, far more than Jorvik panpipe. This instrument really seems to be the centerpiece of that genre of music, but the toggle harpa itself is not Scandinavian, it is Fenno-Scandian. But it's more Karelian, it's Finnish, etc. And its earliest indications in the historical record are found after the Christianization of Scandinavia, therefore after the end of the Viking Age. With all of that said, I am not closed off to the idea that the Vikings specifically, I mean the Vikings in the specific sense, not just the Norse, the Vikings may have used bowed instruments possibly because, see, the history of bowed instruments is sort of its origins are shrouded in mystery. We do know that they came from East Asia, possibly from the Central Asian nomads. It might have something to do with the horsehair. That's one of the dominant theories. Whatever it is, those migrations at the end of antiquity would have brought the category of bowed instruments westwards, and the first indication of them on European soil is the Byzantine lyre of the Eastern Roman Empire. And as we all know, the Scandinavians were in frequent contact with the Eastern Romans, and so I'm not closed off to the idea that they might have gotten their hands on actual bowed instruments and they would have brought them directly over to Scandinavia. This would actually challenge the traditional model of diffusion of bowed instruments, where we typically assume that they started out in southeastern Europe, southeastern Mediterranean really, and gradually made their way upwards, covering all of Europe gradually. Maybe the Norse circumnavigated all of it and brought it directly to Scandinavia. It's a possibility, but we don't have enough, I think, historical indications to be certain of this. And finally, when it comes to acoustic texture, there is no indication nor evidence whatsoever that the Norse had anything like overtone throat singing. It is entirely a modern myth that is propagated by these modern bands. There is literally no evidence for it whatsoever in the historical record, nor any reason in the first place. Like, there's no reason to ask the question, did the Norse have overtone throat singing, any more than we would for the Greeks or the Hittites. You can go watch this video for more information. I will also be doing another video where I will be dissecting this whole genre of modern Viking music in more detail, in which I will be going even further into the details of why we just don't have any evidence, no reason to believe in the first place that they had anything like overtone throat singing. So this is it for the second chapter, and now we move on to the third and final chapter of the video. So now we get to the final chapter of the video, which is, what are the educated guesses that we can make? So again, I talked about how there's certain things that are universal enough where you can just assume that they existed without necessarily needing to have direct evidence. Some things are universally distributed enough in ethnomusicology where there's not necessarily a very heavy burden of proof on them. Now, I want to preface this chapter by saying that when you look at how the Norse are represented in pop culture, the tendency nowadays, especially the current fashion, is to really emphasize a sort of dichotomous, contrasting relationship between the Norse and the rest of Europe, as if the Norse were somehow isolated from the rest of Europe culturally, as if they were completely alien to it. You know, you look at how they're clothed, you look at how their music is represented in pop culture, you'd think that they were this civilization, like the White Walkers from Game of Thrones, isolated in the northern lands. I think a lot of it has to do with the remaining influence of Christian writers from the Middle Ages, because do not forget, most of our information on the Norse comes to us from Christian writers, and they wrote about them, you know, in this light of there are these incredible just monsters. They came from the lands of Thule. They came out of the fog on their drakars, and we don't know what they are. They're not human. I think that has colored our perception more than a little bit. I remember I had that experience where, for the first time, I saw pictures of historically accurate Norse clothing for the first time in my life. And what struck me was, this is surprisingly typical of Northern Europe. It's surprisingly generic, actually, would be the way that I would put it. It felt like generically Northern European. And I did this test with a lot of my friends where I showed them these pictures without telling them what civilization they were from. And I asked them, can you situate those people in a certain historical continuity, in a certain geographical continuity? And they could. They all said, this is clearly Northern European from the early Middle Ages. So my point is that when you look at the Norse culturally, on every level, linguistically, their language was just a Germanic language like the many other Germanic languages of the area. Their poetic tradition was tied to that of the Anglo-Saxons. It was analogous to other Germanic poetic traditions. Their clothing wasn't that different from the Anglo-Saxons. I mean, I personally, the untrained eye, if you show me Anglo-Saxon clothing, I can't tell it apart from Norse clothing or from Kievan Rus clothing. So the point is that on almost every cultural level, linguistic, the literature, if you want to call it that, the poetic tradition, the oral tradition, the clothing, whatever it is, they had more similarities with Northern Europe than dissimilarities. The fact is that the Norse did not appear out of nowhere in Scandinavia, you know, from the ether of nothingness, and suddenly they didn't just manifest there. A few centuries before, these were the Proto-Germanic people. They were in frequent contact with the rest of continental Europe. They were in frequent contact with the rest of the world. They were literally in contact with the Mediterranean by proxy of the Roman Empire. So these people, their alphabet was probably of Greek origin, at least of Mediterranean origin. So the whole point of this little rant, if you will, is to say that in modern pop culture, I think we have this romanticized notion, this tendency to want to really sort of make the Norse into something alien from the rest of the world, and they were unrecognizable, and they were just these, you know, just otherworldly beings growling and throat singing, wearing antlers and walking like this, and always on a trance, always convulsing on the ground while throat singing, or having two axes and 360 no-scoping hordes of Anglo-Saxons. That's just not the case, right? Whatever the music of the Norse would have been, there's no reason to assume that their music would have been completely separate from that of the rest of Northern Europe, given that all the other cultural elements were so analogous to the rest of Europe, were so in sync with the rest of Europe. So what do we know about European music of the early Middle Ages? Well, the primary thing is that, for the most part, it was diatonic and heptatonic. Heptatonic means it was made out of 7-note scales, 7-note melodies. And diatonic, to keep it simple for people who are not into music theory, anything that sounds, how to put it? If it sounds Western European to you, then it's diatonic, most probably. Like, if it doesn't sound exotic, if it sounds just typically Western European to a Western ear, or normal to a Western ear, then it's probably diatonic, except for the Phrygian. But really, that's the easiest way that I can put it, right? The Roman Empire, I don't need to explain how the Roman Empire was the biggest cultural influence in Europe for that time. The Roman Empire used to have a wider variety of melodic modes during antiquity. They had the chromatic modes, which sound sort of jazzy and bluesy and Middle Eastern-y to our ears. These go away, and by the end of it, you were left only with the diatonic modes. So as the curtains close on antiquity and open on the Middle Ages, Europe is basically left only with the diatonic, heptatonic modes. And it has remained so mostly up to this day. For the most part, the rule of thumb of Western European music is that it is heptatonic and diatonic in nature. There's exceptions, of course, but these are always exceptions to the rule. The rule is mostly heptatonic-diatonic because by the end of the Roman Empire, we know that the Roman Empire, they only used diatonic modes. The earliest medieval compositions, and in fact, pretty much every Western European medieval composition is entirely diatonic, with very few exceptions if there are, and I don't know of any. I'm sure somebody will be eager to point like that out that one exception, but again, I'm talking about the general rule. And the earliest compositions found in Scandinavia are also heptatonic and diatonic. So I think it's pretty safe to assume that whatever their music would have sounded like, the melodic material would have sounded typically Western European. In other words, their melodies wouldn't have been that different from modern Scandinavian folk melodies. They probably would have been pretty similar in their general framework. The second thing that we can assume is pentatonicism. Now, pentatonicism might be the human universal in music. Pentatonicism means 5-note structures, 5-note scales, 5-note melodies. Now, as far as I understand, the pentatonic major is the most widely distributed scale across all of humankind. Like, pentatonic is sort of the standard human scale. It's really sort of the dominant one across all of humanity. And it is found again in Scandinavia in Sami music. For good reasons, we assume that the Sami might be the keepers of some of the oldest traditions in Fennoscandia, and their music is entirely pentatonic. For the most part, I'm sure that it's not entirely, possibly with the influence of the rest of Europe, but you listen to yoik, for example, you're dealing with completely pentatonic music, and a lot of people, they hear yoik, they're like, is that Native American or Mongolian? I can't even place it actually, because of that pentatonic nature. And even within the heptatonic-diatonic framework of most Western European medieval music, you still have pentatonic passages. Western European music tends to like skipping certain notes and having pentatonic passages. Perhaps the entire framework is not pentatonic, but there will be elements of pentatonicism here and there. And so I think we can just be pretty certain that the Norse would have had heptatonic diatonic melodies with a lot of pentatonicism in it, either as in passages or entire modal frameworks probably, and then the same melody. And so really, if you want to have a very general sound image in your mind of what the music of the Norse would have been like, just listen to modern Scandinavian music, because their music is still mostly heptatonic and diatonic. There's a lot of pentatonicism in it. That's probably the exact same melodic material that the Norse would have had in the early Middle Ages. And just imagine it without the harmony, without the chords, imagine it without the modern instruments, imagine it on those ancient instruments, and you're pretty much going to be, not that far off when it comes to the very general framework of Norse music. Yes, I do have this crazy theory that if you want to look at modern traditions in order to glean what the music of the Norse would have been like, Scandinavian music of today might be a better indication than Mongolian music. I know how crazy of me. I'm a maverick. I'm a rebel. I live dangerously. What can I say? For the most part, that would have been the case. But unfortunately, all we can really assume with certainty is the vaguest possible generalities of Old Norse music. At the end of the day, the music of the Viking Age in Scandinavia will be forever lost to us unless by some miracle we find, treatises describing their music, but that's not likely to happen. So their music has gone with the wind, which is very sad indeed. Anyway, I shall be making a follow-up video to this one in a few weeks where I will be talking about the modern genre of Viking music and explaining why it's entirely modern, it's not historical, and really breaking down the cultural psychology of this genre. For example, why do they use throat singing, when there's really no reason to believe that they had it, there's no evidence, and sort of breaking that down more in detail.
Hello? I am Ahmed ibn Fadlan. I am lost in Scandinavia. Is there anybody here? Please help. Please. I am going to die of cold. Wallah, I am going to die. Inshallah, I will not.